The knowledge we lost starts with a detail most people walk past. A door. Not a cathedral door on a postcard. Not a ceremonial gate. A working entrance, worn at the handle, polished where hands have touched it for decades. 14 feet high. The handle sits close to 8 feet from the ground. You can see the darkened metal where it was used again and again at roughly the same height. If the door was only meant to impress, you would expect decoration. A symbolic scale. Something theatrical. But where is not symbolic? Where suggests routine. And routine raises a quiet contradiction. A building can be grand, but hardware doesn't get used that way unless someone needed it that way. The accepted explanation accounts for some things, but not this. The official story is straightforward. In the late 1800s, the United States and parts of Europe experienced a construction boom. Industrial materials were cheap. Labor was abundant. Railroads moved stone and steel quickly. Architects reused proven designs. Pattern books circulated. Skilled immigrant craftsmen brought old-world methods into new cities. In that context, a cathedral with tall doors is not strange. It is simply ambitious. That explanation accounts for logistics. It accounts for style. It accounts for why cities wanted monumental buildings. What's missing here is the human interface. When a building is truly symbolic, the symbolic parts are separated from daily use. A towering facade can exist above normal entrances. A grand arch can sit over a smaller door. The scale can be theatrical without changing the way people actually move through the space. But in many of these late 1800s cathedrals, the overscale features are not limited to facades. They appear in the parts built to be touched. Doors that do not narrow at the bottom. Handles placed too high to be comfortable. Stair risers that feel unusually tall. Windows set high above the floor line, not as clearstory glass, but as ordinary windows in rooms meant to be occupied. And when those choices repeat across different cities in different countries under different architects, they stop looking like personal taste. They start looking like a design standard. The scale problem is easiest to notice when you stop thinking like a tourist and start thinking like a builder. A builder measures what matters. If a doorway is oversized, you ask why. If a staircase is steep, you ask who climbs it. If a ceiling is high, you ask what the space is meant to hold. In an ordinary building, most dimensions fall into a predictable band. Door widths, handle heights, windowsills, step heights. These are human-scale choices. They are not aesthetic first. They are functional first. That is why building codes exist now. Codes did not invent comfort. They formalized what builders already knew. So when you find a structure where comfort seems ignored, not in one detail but across many, it suggests a different assumption about the user. Not a different culture, a different body. There are cathedrals completed in the 1880s where the interior proportions feel normal until you focus on transitions. The places where a person is supposed to move from one level to another. The places where a person is supposed to touch the building. You see staircases where each step feels closer to the knee than the ankle. You see landings that seem spaced for longer strides. You see doors inside the building that remain tall even when there is no reason to impress anyone. You see second-level doors that open into corridors where the ceiling height remains unusually high, even though nobody is gathering there. You can call it grand. You can call it Gothic. But Gothic style does not require a door handle at 8 feet. At some point, the measurements stop sounding like design and start sounding like adaptation. And then another question appears: were these features built to be used or built and then reused? The official explanation tends to treat late 1800s cathedrals as single, continuous projects. A congregation funds a church. An architect designs it. Contractor builds it. It opens. End of story. That story fits many buildings. But it does not fit the way some of these structures sit in the record. Because when you look for the boring parts of the paperwork, the parts that should be easiest to find, you sometimes find silence instead. Construction photos are not as common as you would expect. Not photos of a finished cathedral, but photos of the messy middle. Scaffolding, stone cutting, hoisting, staging yards, temporary cranes, half-finished arches. Those images exist for some projects. They are not absent everywhere. But in places where the finished building is heavily photographed and the process is barely documented, it raises a question about time. Not how long the building took in the official narrative, but how long the key steps actually took. A slow build produces a trail. A fast build produces a gap. The scale problem becomes harder to ignore when you compare public capacity to local population. Many late 1800s civic buildings, not just cathedrals, were designed to hold crowds that the city did not yet have. Waiting rooms with 40-foot ceilings. Halls with acoustics calibrated for thousands. Entryways that can swallow a wagon without turning. The standard answer is future growth. That explanation accounts for some things, but not this. Future growth is not a reason to place a doorknob higher than a man's head. Future growth might justify a larger room. It might justify more seating. It might justify thicker foundations. It does not explain why the building's contact points appear built for a different reach. Once you notice this in one building, it becomes harder to ignore elsewhere. Cathedral in one city, a train station in another, a courthouse in a third, a library with enormous interior doors leading to ordinary offices, a municipal building where the grand entry is not just a grand entry, but the daily entry worn and polished from use. First, it feels like style. Then it starts to feel like a pattern. And you begin to see the pattern in places where nobody would bother to exaggerate for effect. Basements, service corridors, stairwells, back entrances, utility spaces. If the overscale shows up in the parts hidden from the public, it suggests the scale was not created only for spectacle. It suggests it was part of a template. A template implies prior knowledge, standardization, an assumption about dimensions that builders expected to repeat. And a template has an origin. That is where the question becomes uncomfortable, because origins require records. Late 1800s bureaucracies were not casual about paperwork. Not in cities. Not in major church projects. Not in projects that required fundraising, permits, insurance, and public attention. So when the paperwork is thin or inconsistent, or missing in just the places you would expect it to be complete, you do not need to accuse anyone of hiding anything. You only need to notice that the expected trail is incomplete. Maps are one place the trail should be solid. Urban maps from the 1800s are detailed. Insurance maps are especially detailed. They exist because money demanded accuracy. A building was not just a building. It was a risk. Insurers documented construction materials, wall thickness, roof types, even fire breaks. And yet, in some cities, you can find map-to-map changes that feel too clean. A structure appears fully formed on a map, without the gradual emergence you would expect. Or a district layout changes in a way that implies major demolition or major construction, but the corresponding narrative is thin. There are practical reasons that can happen. Fires, for example, rebuilds after disaster, clerical mistakes. That explanation accounts for some things, but not for the repeated feeling that the record jumps over the most difficult part of the story. If a cathedral's foundation required moving massive stone, there should be records of quarries, shipments, staging, labor arrangements. Those things exist for certain projects. For others, what survives is often a polished narrative. A cornerstone ceremony, a dedication, a list of donors, a proud photo. The middle is vague. And vague is not a crime. It is just a condition. But when vague overlaps with physical anomalies, it starts to matter. Because the physical object is still there. The building is still there. And the building keeps asking the same question. Why is everything so large? At this point, the investigation splits into two possibilities, and neither one settles the discomfort. Possibility 1. These buildings were designed oversized on purpose, as an aesthetic and spiritual statement, and the functional mismatches are either overinterpreted or incidental. Possibility 2. The oversized features reflect a design inheritance that did not originate with the people who later claimed the structure. That second possibility does not require giants. It does not require fantasy. It does not require any single dramatic claim. It only requires reuse. Reuse is common in history. People build on older foundations. They incorporate older walls. They convert older buildings to new uses. They occupy what already exists. If that happened at a larger scale than we usually admit, it would create a specific kind of evidence. It would create buildings where the shell feels too large for the occupants. It would create doors that feel like they belong to another era. It would create staircases that do not fit the average stride. It would create basements and sublevels that are sealed, filled, or simplified because they do not match the new use. It would also create paperwork that feels oddly detached from the physical reality, because the paperwork describes construction, while the work might have been more like adaptation, repair, and rebranding. But even this explanation has limits, because some of these buildings are not just reused shells. They are technically demanding in ways that adaptation alone does not explain. Acoustics are one example. Certain large halls from that period have acoustics that remain unusually clean for their size, even without electronic amplification. This is not magic. It is geometry, materials, and construction precision. You can build good acoustics today. We know how. What raises questions is how consistently it appears in an era when surveying tools and material uniformity were less refined than modern standards. It is not impossible. It is just surprisingly common in structures that also share other recurring choices. High vaults, thick masonry, and a particular kind of repetitive geometry that appears in different places as if copied from the same underlying logic. Copying is not suspicious. Copying is how builders learn. But copying at that scale suggests an institutional knowledge base that should leave traces. Manuals, apprenticeships, specialized tool inventories, detailed training records. Some of that exists. Some of it does not. And the missing parts matter because they are the parts that would tell you how a technique spread and who controlled it. The phrase lost knowledge usually gets used as a slogan. Here, it begins to sound more like a description of a break. Not a slow decline. A discontinuity. You can sense it when you compare what was built before a certain period and what gets built after. The late 1800s produced a certain class of civic and religious architecture. Heavy, monumental, mathematically repetitive, and unusually tolerant in structural terms. Then, within a generation, the style changes, which is normal, but the engineering appetite changes too. Buildings become lighter. Materials shift. Ornament becomes less structural and more decorative. The new world begins to prefer speed and cost efficiency, which is understandable. But the question is not why tastes changed. The question is why certain capabilities seem to stop being expressed in the same way. If the knowledge was common, it should have become more common. Industrialization usually amplifies capability. It spreads it. So why does the record sometimes feel like a peak that is not fully explained, followed by a simplification that is narrated as progress? This is where archives matter, not because they prove a theory, but because they show what people thought was worth writing down. If you read 1800s reports, you begin to notice a language difference over time. Earlier technical documents often described physical realities bluntly. Measurements, materials, problems, solutions. Later documents, especially when describing older structures, sometimes drift into generalized language. Modernized, improved, updated, rebuilt. These words can describe real work. They can also hide the exact nature of the work. A building can be rebuilt in a way that is mostly repair and rebranding, or it can be rebuilt in a way that replaces everything but a foundation. The same word can cover both. If you are trying to understand origins, vague words are a problem, because vague words are doors that do not open. And then there are the moments when documents do not become vague. They stop. A survey that ends without explanation. A report that notes an anomaly and then moves on. A site described as incompatible with expectations and then recommended for exclusion from further study. Excluded is a gentle word. It does not accuse anyone. It does not claim malice. But it does something else. It signals a boundary. It signals that a researcher saw something that did not fit their framework, and rather than expand the framework, they chose to set the thing aside. That is not unusual in science or bureaucracy. People work within objectives. If something is not relevant, it is postponed. The problem is what postponement does over time. A postponed anomaly becomes an orphan. An orphaned anomaly becomes folklore, and folklore is easy to dismiss. If you wanted a hidden history to disappear without destroying it, you would not need to burn archives. You would only need to keep important anomalies in the category of not relevant, long enough that nobody connects them into a pattern. Because a single oversized door is nothing. A single weird staircase is nothing. A single missing set of permits is nothing. But a repeated set of mismatches across different regions, across different building types, across the same decades, begins to feel like a layer under the official story. Not an alternate universe. Prior layer. This is the point where it helps to step back and define the investigation carefully. This is not about proving a civilization that the record denies. It is about asking why the record describes certain buildings as if they appeared through ordinary means, while the physical features suggest a design logic that does not fit the stated users. It is about noticing that the human in human-scale architecture sometimes feels like an afterthought. And if that is true, then a new question appears. If the buildings were not designed around the average body, what were they designed around? There are safe answers to that question. They were designed around spectacle. They were designed around aspiration. They were designed around theological ideas of grandeur. They were designed around civic pride. All of those are real forces, but those forces still operate through people. A cathedral might be tall to point to heaven, but a handle is placed where a hand can reach. A staircase might be steep to save space, but it is still built so people can climb it repeatedly. When the daily use components drift out of reach, you have to explain why. One explanation is that these buildings were designed for processions, for clergy investments, for formal movement that required wider clearances. That accounts for some things, but not for repeated handle height. Not for repeated window placement that makes viewing the street difficult from inside. Not for the sense, in certain interiors, that the architecture expects a taller eye line than the average person provides. Another explanation is that the scale is a byproduct of structural principles. Thick walls, tall arches, large spans. You need mass to hold stone vaults, so you get height and thickness. That accounts for some things. But it does not require 14-foot interior doors between ordinary rooms. It does not require high handles. It does not require steep stairs built as if comfort were not considered. A third explanation is that the buildings were built by people who were physically the same as us, but who operated with different assumptions about space and proportion, perhaps inherited from older European traditions. This is plausible. But then the question becomes, why do those traditions appear so strongly in certain places and periods, and then appear to fade even as the population that carried them grew? And why do some of the most extreme examples cluster in the same narrow time window? The 1880s are not just any decade. They sit in a transition between worlds. Before, masonry dominance, slower construction, local craft. After, steel frames, standardized parts, speed, and eventually concrete. In the middle, you get hybrid structures, old-looking forms built in industrial cities. If there is a place where lost knowledge could hide, it would be in a transition zone, where one system replaces another and paperwork redefines what counts as normal. That leads to the disappearance event, not as a single day, but as a shift. A shift in what gets built. A shift in how buildings are described. A shift in what gets preserved. A shift in what gets sealed. There are buildings from that era with sublevels that are no longer accessible. Not just basements, but deeper spaces. Chambers that are shown on early plans, then removed from later plans, or filled for reasons described only in general terms like stabilization. Stabilization is a reasonable word, but it is also a word that ends curiosity. Once a space is filled, it can no longer be inspected easily. Once a space is sealed, it becomes speculative. Once it becomes speculative, the official story wins by default, because speculation is not admissible in a file cabinet. If the goal was not to destroy evidence but to remove it from daily awareness, sealing works. Not because it is sinister, because it is practical. City management does not like unknown voids under buildings. Insurance does not like it. Engineers do not like it. Safety officials do not like it. So a space is filled. A door is bricked. A tunnel is closed. And the building continues above it as if nothing ever existed below. That is how history disappears without anyone covering it up. It becomes infrastructure. But even if you accept every reasonable explanation, one uncomfortable question remains. Why do the same buildings that feel oversized also feel overbuilt? Many of these structures were not built for 100 years. They were built as if they were expected to survive indefinitely. The stonework is not just decorative. It is structural, massive, redundant. The geometry repeats in ways that distribute loads elegantly. The foundations are often deeper than the soil conditions seem to require. Engineers can explain this. They will tell you, builders overbuilt because they feared failure. They overbuilt because calculation methods were conservative. They overbuilt because materials varied. That accounts for some things, but not for the consistency of certain choices across distant sites. If overbuilding was simply fear, it would vary more. If it was an inherited template, it would repeat. And repetition is what keeps showing up. At this point, the investigation turns away from individual buildings and toward the behavior of records. Because if there really was a break in knowledge or a shift in how these structures were understood, you would expect the paper to show it. Not in the form of a confession, in the form of a change in language, a change in classification, a change in what is described as relevant, a change in what is described as modern. There are moments in the late 1800s and early 1900s where documents begin to treat certain older building forms as problems to be managed, not achievements to be repeated. Older masonry is outdated. Deep foundations are unnecessary. Ornament is wasteful. The new system values speed and standardization, which makes sense. But it also changes what survives. When a society stops building one kind of thing, the people who know how to build it do not necessarily disappear. They retire, they die, they move. The knowledge survives if it is transmitted. And transmission leaves traces. Apprenticeships, trade journals, manuals, tool makers advertising specialized equipment. Some of that trace is thin. Sometimes it feels like the buildings remain far more present than the methods that created them. That mismatch is not definitive. It is just odd, which brings the investigation back to the title's promise. If there was knowledge here, and if it was lost, the evidence would look like this: finished results that remain undeniable, process documentation that feels incomplete, language that shifts from detailed description to vague reassignment, and a generation later, a quiet consensus that the old way is no longer necessary, or perhaps no longer possible. If you accept that framework, a final set of questions begins to form, and they do not need answers to be unsettling. Why do so many of these cathedrals and civic buildings feel designed for a taller eye line? Why do the handles sit where they do? Why do the staircases climb the way they do? Why do some interior doors remain massive even when nobody would see them? Why do certain districts show abrupt map changes without corresponding build narratives? Why are the messy middle stages of construction less visible than the polished ceremonies? Why do the most mathematically repetitive structures cluster in a narrow time window, then fade? Why do sealed sublevels appear again and again? And why do the reasons given often end at general words? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all: if the builders of the 1880s truly had this knowledge in a robust, institutional way, why does it sometimes feel like the knowledge is expressed through finished monuments, but not through a clear, continuous lineage of teaching? There is a way to make these questions go away. You can tell yourself the scale is aesthetic. You can tell yourself the missing records are coincidence. You can tell yourself the gap is just the past being messy. Those answers are not unreasonable, but they do not fully explain the wear marks on the hardware. They do not fully explain why functional elements repeat the same mismatches across many buildings. And they do not fully explain why, when you look for the ordinary paper trail behind extraordinary work, the paper sometimes feels less solid than the stone. The open ending is not a conclusion. It is a reframing. The question is not whether people in the 1880s built cathedrals. They did. The question is whether the buildings we see today are only the result of the story we repeat, or whether they are also the result of a prior layer that the story absorbed. Not a secret empire, not a single hidden civilization, just a set of techniques, templates, and assumptions that appear briefly, repeat widely, and then become hard to trace. A kind of knowledge that might not have vanished overnight, but that became unimportant fast enough to stop being documented in the places we would expect to find it. And once documentation stops, knowledge becomes rumor. Then it becomes impossible to teach. Then it becomes lost. If you want to keep looking at this with me, you can like the video, leave what you've noticed in the comments, and subscribe.